When we think of Virginia Woolf, a certain image often comes to mind: the ethereal, melancholic, modernist. She is the tragic feminist icon, the spectral face of the Bloomsbury Group, forever defined by the shadows of her mental illness. But this portrait, while powerful, is dangerously incomplete. To reduce her to these archetypes is to miss the vibrant, surprising, and profoundly physical woman who lived behind the legend. Today, we peel back those layers to reveal a Woolf who was not only a titan of literature, but also a mischievous prankster, a shrewd businesswoman, and a domestic battle-axe. We begin by exploring the most intimate and often overlooked aspect of her existence, the profound connection between her body, her senses, and her art. Woolf's life was a constant negotiation with her own physical and mental state. She suffered from what was then diagnosed as Neurasthenia, a vague term for a condition we now understand as a severe form of bipolar disorder. But for Woolf, this was not merely a mental affliction, it was a radical alteration of her entire reality, an experience grounded in the raw, unfiltered sensations of her body. She sought to capture what she called her moments of being. In her memoir, A Sketch of the Past, she described these not as memories of events, but as pure, overwhelming sensations. The rolling rhythm of the waves at street Ives, the soft touch of flower petals on her mother's dress, the yellow splash of light on her nursery wall. These vivid flashes of existence stood in stark contrast to what she termed the cotton wool of non-being, the dull fabric of everyday life. Her life's work was to translate this hypersensitive internal world onto the page. During her most severe breakdown in 1904, following her father's death, this sensory world turned against her. Her hallucinations were terrifyingly specific. She famously claimed that the birds in her garden were singing in Greek, a horrifying fusion of her classical education with the natural world outside her window. The recently deceased King Edward VII, she believed, was hiding in the bushes, shouting obscenities. Her mind was collapsing the barriers between thought and reality, and her senses had become the battleground. This intense internal struggle extended to her own reflection. She spoke of the horror of the looking glass, a phrase that conveyed a deep-seated anxiety far beyond simple vanity. For Woolf, her reflected image was a hostile, alien entity, a physical shell that did not align with her internal self. This profound disconnection is powerfully fictionalized in her novel The Waves, through the character of Rhoda, who looks in the mirror and feels she has no face. Beyond the cycles of her mental health, Woolf's body was a constant site of physical ailment. She lived in the shadow of the 1918 influenza pandemic and suffered from recurring, severe bouts of the flu, along with debilitating headaches and heart palpitations. Her diaries meticulously record this suffering. She described her headaches not merely as pain, but as a vibrating instrument that made her brain feel like it was boiling. Yet, even in this agony, she found creative potential. In her powerful essay, On Being Ill, she argued that illness removes us from the tedious obligations of daily life, allowing the mind to wander into the undiscovered countries of thought. This altered, feverish state of heightened sensory awareness, where the pattern on the wallpaper becomes menacing and the sound of a coal scuttle is deafening, is channeled directly into the consciousness of characters like the shell-shocked Septimus Smith in Mrs. Dalloway. The prescribed treatment for her breakdowns was the infamous rest cure, a brutal regimen of forced isolation, overfeeding with vast quantities of milk, and a complete ban on reading or writing. This was a torturous experience where her body became a prison controlled by others. Her complex relationship with food, often bordering on anorexia during depressive episodes, can be seen as a desperate attempt to reclaim some measure of control over her own physical self. And yet, from this landscape of intense physical and psychological struggle, a completely different figure emerges. To fully subvert the somber image of the suffering artist, we must travel back to 1910. Here we meet a 28-year-old Virginia Stephen, a daring, comical, and audaciously anti-authoritarian prankster. She became a key player in one of the most celebrated hoaxes of the 20th century, the Dreadnought Hoax, orchestrated by the infamous trickster Horace de Vere Cole. The plan was simple in its audacity: to impersonate a delegation of Abyssinian or modern-day Ethiopian royals, and gain a private, full-honours tour of the Royal Navy's flagship, HMS Dreadnought, the most powerful warship in the world. The group, which included Virginia, her brother Adrian, and their friend Duncan Grant, hired a theatrical costumer. They darkened their skin with grease paint, wore elaborate robes, and donned fake beards. Virginia, fully committed to the role, was disguised as a silent, heavily bearded male prince. They concocted a gibberish language, a mixture of Latin and Greek, which they punctuated with the enthusiastic phrase "bunga bunga" whenever they saw something they supposedly appreciated. A forged telegram, supposedly from the Foreign Office, was sent to the naval base announcing the imminent arrival of the foreign dignitaries. The Royal Navy was completely fooled. They rolled out the red carpet, receiving the royals with a full honor guard. The ship's commander, who was, by sheer coincidence, a cousin of Virginia and Adrian, gave them a personal tour. The pranksters struggled to suppress their laughter, especially when the Navy band, unsure of the appropriate anthem, was thrown into confusion. The hoax was a spectacular success. Upon their return to London, Cole immediately leaked the story to the Daily Mirror, complete with a photograph of the costumed participants. The Royal Navy was publicly humiliated. The affair became a national scandal, with questions asked in Parliament. This single event offers a stunning glimpse into the rebellious, playful spirit of the young Bloomsbury group and reveals a side of Virginia Woolf almost entirely absent from her public persona, a woman who delighted in absurdity and held a deep disdain for pompous authority. From the intensely private world of her sensory experience, we turn to a surprisingly public and practical endeavor, revealing Virginia Woolf not merely as an author of modernism, but as one of its key architects. This transformation begins in 1917, not in a boardroom, but in a dining room. This was the birthplace of the Hogarth Press. It began as a therapeutic hobby, a manual distraction from the intense mental labor of writing. For the sum of £19, Virginia and her husband Leonard purchased a small, hand-operated printing machine and set it up on their dining table. They taught themselves the arduous craft of setting type, arranging individual metal letters backwards in a composing stick. The work was physical and messy. In her letters, Virginia complains of being up to the elbows in black ink. They physically pulled the lever for every single page, then collated, folded, stitched, and bound the pamphlets themselves, often using brightly colored, patterned papers designed by her sister, Vanessa Bell, which became a signature of their early editions. This hands-on control, however, was the entire point. The Hogarth Press quickly evolved from a hobby into a shield, granting Virginia absolute artistic freedom. She could write whatever she wanted, no matter how experimental, knowing she had a guaranteed outlet, a freedom essential for the creation of novels like Jacob's Room and The Waves. But the press became much more than a personal project. The Woolfs possessed an incredible eye for talent, transforming their amateur operation into a cultural tastemaker. In 1923, they took a significant risk by publishing T.S. Eliot's notoriously difficult poem, The Wasteland, after other publishers had rejected it. Virginia herself set some of the type, but their most monumental gamble came in 1924, when they undertook the immense task of publishing the first complete English translations of Sigmund Freud's works. This decision was a commercial and intellectual masterstroke. It transformed the Hogarth Press from a small literary boutique into a major intellectual force. And here lies a fascinating truth. It was the steady sales of Freud, not Woolf's own modernist masterpieces, that kept the press financially viable for many years. Virginia was deeply involved in every aspect, reading manuscripts, designing jackets, and operating the press. She was a shrewd and often harsh critic, a craftswoman and businesswoman who actively built the very structure that would guarantee her own artistic liberation. But while she was building an empire, she was also engaged in a deeply personal and far more fraught professional relationship. This was her intricate rivalry with the writer Katherine Mansfield. It is often simplified as pure jealousy, but the reality was a complex cocktail of mutual admiration, class snobbery, professional insecurity, and a profound, unfulfilled longing for connection. Upon their first meeting, Woolf was dismissive, her Bloomsbury privilege on full display. She described Mansfield, a colonial from New Zealand, as common, and noted her cheap scent. Yet, beneath this snobbery lay a deep and immediate sense of threat. After reading Mansfield's story, Prelude, Woolf confessed to her diary a stunning admission. "She is the only writer I am jealous of." What bound them was a shared artistic mission. Both were pioneers, striving to break free from the traditional Edwardian novel. They sought to capture the fleeting, internal, luminous halo of life, the very stream of consciousness. In a world of literature focused on external plots, they were, in a sense, the only two people who truly understood what the other was trying to achieve. Their relationship was a constant dance of suspicion and competition. Woolf sometimes accused Mansfield of borrowing her ideas. After reading Mansfield's celebrated story Bliss, Woolf was thrown into a competitive frenzy, a drive that directly led to her own experimental story, The Mark on the Wall. They were sharpening their art on the whetstone of the other's talent. The most poignant chapter of their story came with Mansfield's tragically early death from tuberculosis in 1923 at the age of 34. Woolf's diary entry on that day is not one of triumph, but of profound and desolate loss. She wrote, "When I began to write, it was a horrid feeling that Katherine would not read it. Katherine is no longer a rival. I have a feeling of being left alone. I was jealous of her writing, the only writing I have ever been jealous of. But now she is dead, and I am left." In that moment of grief, the truth is laid bare. Mansfield was not just a rival. She was her only true peer, her artistic other half. Her death removed the one person whose judgment and competition Woolf valued above all others, revealing their rivalry for what it truly was: a powerful, irreplaceable engine for literary innovation. From the rarefied world of literary innovation, we descend into the messy, contradictory domestic realities of the Bloomsbury household. While remembered for its progressive, bohemian ethos, this life was built upon a bedrock of traditional class structures. At the heart of this contradiction was what Virginia Woolf obsessively called the servant problem. Her relationship with her long-serving cook, Nellie Boxall, was a microcosm of this tension. For nearly 2 decades, their dynamic followed a stormy, predictable pattern, all meticulously recorded in Woolf's diaries. One day, she would praise Nellie's cooking. The next, she would descend into fury over a perceived slight, writing pages about Nellie's tyranny. There were screaming matches and dramatic resignations. On one occasion, in a fit of pique, Virginia threw a bag of sugar onto the kitchen floor. This cycle of conflict, followed by tearful reconciliation, repeated endlessly. At its root was a difficult truth. Woolf, unable and unwilling to manage a household, was utterly dependent on Nellie. And this dependence bred a deep resentment. The kitchen became a battleground where the intellectual world of the writer collided with the physical reality she could not control. She was painfully aware of the hypocrisy. As a socialist and the feminist author of A Room of One's Own, a book about the economic subjugation of women, her own creative freedom was entirely dependent on the poorly paid labor of another woman. This filled her with both intense irritation and a profound, unsettling guilt. She wrote in her diary of the appalling gulf between us. This constant domestic friction seeps into her novels. The world of servants is not just background detail. Characters like Mrs. McNabb in To the Lighthouse are the invisible machinery that allows the upper-class characters their lives of leisure and thought. Mrs. McNabb, groaning as she single-handedly cleans the long-abandoned Ramsay house, is a powerful symbol of the physical labor that underpins the ethereal world of ideas. This reveals Woolf not as a disembodied voice in an ivory tower, but as a privileged woman of her time, grappling often unsuccessfully with a class structure she both critiqued and benefited from. So, what emerges from these lesser-known facets of her life? Not just the melancholic modernist, but a sensory genius whose art was forged in the crucible of her own body. Not just an ethereal artist, but an ink-stained publisher who built a literary empire. Not just a serious intellectual, but an audacious prankster. Not just a solitary genius, but a fierce rival. And not just a progressive idealist, but a conflicted mistress of a household. Virginia Woolf's life was not a neat narrative, but a rich, contradictory tapestry. It is precisely this complexity that makes her an enduringly fascinating human being, and not just a literary legend. What surprised you most about Virginia Woolf? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this exploration, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history and literature. Until next time.